In October 2012, the lifeless body of Dr. Andrew Whitman, a respected surgeon, was discovered in the living room of his upscale Green Valley, Ohio home. His death was brutal and shocking, but the real story lay in the events that led up to it. An investigation would reveal a tangled web of betrayal, manipulation, and revenge. It all began in 2007 when Elizabeth Whitman, Andrew's devoted wife, fell into a coma after a devastating car accident. Over the next 5 years, a series of choices and hidden truths would turn a seemingly perfect marriage into a tragedy that captivated the nation. At 6:47 a.m. on October 15th, the peaceful morning in the quiet suburban neighborhood of Green Valley, Ohio, was shattered by a loud banging sound coming from the Whitman residence. The noise was jarring, waking neighbors who had grown accustomed to the calm that defined their street. 2 houses down, an elderly woman named Mrs. Harper, still in her floral nightgown, clutched her chest as she struggled to place the sound, a deep, rhythmic thudding that sent chills through the early morning air. She hesitated for a moment before picking up her phone to dial 911, her trembling fingers barely able to press the buttons. The police arrived swiftly, the blue and red lights of their patrol cars casting flickering shadows across the manicured lawns. As they approached the Whitman house, the front door stood slightly ajar, an ominous invitation into the chaos within. Officer Jared Timmons, a young recruit still adjusting to the unpredictability of the job, was the first to step inside. What greeted him froze him in place. Blood was smeared across the polished wooden floor, forming a haphazard trail leading deeper into the house. The Whitman home, often admired for its tasteful decor and pristine condition, now felt cold and foreboding. The once inviting space, with its soft beige walls and family portraits, was tainted by the stark crimson stains. The trail ended in the living room, a space once filled with laughter and shared memories, now dominated by a chilling silence. Dr. Andrew Whitman's body was slumped against the base of the grand stone fireplace, his lifeless form unnervingly still. His head, tilted at an unnatural angle, bore the marks of repeated violence. Blood splattered the white walls behind him in jagged, almost deliberate patterns, each mark a silent testament to the brutality of the act. His crisp white shirt, now soaked through with deep red, was a stark contrast to the neatly arranged furniture and the elegant rug beneath him. Beside his body lay the weapon, a heavy iron sculpture shaped like a tree branch, one that Elizabeth had given him years ago as a symbol of their enduring bond. It was supposed to represent strength and resilience, but now it told a far darker story. In the kitchen, Elizabeth Whitman sat at the small oak table, her hands resting flat against its surface, smeared with blood. Her long dark hair was disheveled, and streaks of red stained the pale blue robe she wore. She stared blankly ahead, her expression eerily serene, as though the chaos that surrounded her existed in another world. The air in the room felt heavy, almost suffocating, carrying with it the metallic tang of blood and the faint aroma of the coffee Andrew had brewed earlier that morning. The officers moved cautiously, unsure of what to expect. Elizabeth didn't flinch as they entered. She made no move to escape, no effort to explain. She simply sat there, as still as the scene around her, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. One officer spoke to her, his voice steady but edged with unease. The words seemed to hang in the air between them, unanswered, until she finally broke her silence. Her response was flat, almost devoid of emotion, as though she were stating a fact rather than confessing to the horror that had unfolded. She mentioned that he had deserved it. The words hung in the officers' minds as they continued to process the scene. They couldn't ignore the layers of significance in her statement. Elizabeth Whitman, the woman who had spent 5 years in a coma following a devastating car accident, had woken up just weeks earlier. Her recovery had been nothing short of miraculous, celebrated by neighbors and friends as a testament to her strength. Now, she sat in the same home that had been the symbol of her and Andrew's perfect life, calm amid the chaos of what she had done. As the officers escorted Elizabeth from the kitchen, one of them noticed the faint outline of a framed photograph still hanging on the wall behind her. It was a picture of Andrew and Elizabeth on their 10th wedding anniversary, smiling brightly, holding the iron sculpture together. That same sculpture, now stained and scarred, lay a few feet away, transformed from a token of love into an instrument of violence. The contrast was jarring, a cruel reminder of how quickly something cherished could be corrupted. Outside, the neighbors gathered, whispering among themselves as Elizabeth was led out of the house. Some gasped at the sight of her blood-stained robe, while others murmured in disbelief. This was the woman they had always seen as gentle and kind, the devoted wife who had endured unimaginable hardship. Now she was the center of a chilling story that no one could yet fully comprehend. The ambulance arrived shortly after to take Andrew's body. As the paramedics carried him out on a stretcher, the neighbors fell silent, their eyes fixed on the man who had once been a pillar of the community. The scene was surreal, almost cinematic, as the flashing lights reflected off the polished windows of the Whitman home, casting long, distorted shadows across the lawn. The events of October 15th marked the beginning of a mystery that would grip Green Valley and beyond. The pieces of the story were there: blood, betrayal, and a woman who had endured years of silence. But the full picture remained shrouded in questions. As Elizabeth sat in the back of the police car, her face expressionless, one question lingered in the minds of everyone who had seen the scene that morning. What had truly happened inside the Whitman house, and what could drive someone like Elizabeth to such a brutal act? In early September 2012, Elizabeth Whitman awoke to a world that felt unfamiliar, yet hauntingly familiar. The sunlight streaming through the windows of her bedroom felt brighter, harsher after 5 years of darkness. The scent of lavender lingered in the air, the same fragrance she used to love, but it felt strange now, like a relic of a past life. Elizabeth was awake, but the quiet sense of triumph from her miraculous recovery was overshadowed by a deep unease she couldn't yet explain. Her husband, Dr. Andrew Whitman, stood by her bedside, his smile tight and forced. To an outsider, it might have seemed like joy, but to Elizabeth, there was something unsettling about the way he looked at her. It wasn't love or relief. It was apprehension, maybe even fear. Andrew, the devoted husband who had cared for her throughout her coma, was supposed to be her anchor in this moment. Instead, his presence felt cold and distant, like the warmth she once knew in him had been extinguished long ago. Margaret Stone, the nurse who had been living in the Whitman home under the guise of caregiving, left quietly within days of Elizabeth's awakening. There was no farewell, no sense of gratitude for the time spent tending to her. Elizabeth didn't need words to sense the tension between Margaret and Andrew. The way Margaret avoided eye contact and the hurried manner in which she packed her belongings spoke volumes. Andrew dismissed her departure as a simple necessity, saying they no longer needed a live-in nurse. But the unease in his tone told Elizabeth there was more to the story. As Elizabeth began her slow and painful recovery, fragments of her time in the coma started surfacing. Her body had been still for years, but her mind had not been entirely asleep. She remembered the sound of Andrew's voice, low and urgent, whispering things he thought she couldn't hear. There had been nights when she felt the prick of a needle in her arm, a sensation that lingered even as she drifted in and out of consciousness. And then there was Margaret, her voice, her presence, the sound of her laughter echoing through the house. It wasn't the laughter of a nurse, professional and distant. It was the laughter of a woman comfortable, even intimate, in a place that wasn't hers. Elizabeth had no proof, only vague memories and a gnawing feeling that something had gone terribly wrong in her absence. As the weeks went by, her strength returned, and with it came a sharper clarity. She started observing Andrew more closely, the way he avoided being alone in the room with her for too long, the tension that seemed to radiate from him whenever their eyes met. He was a man on edge, and Elizabeth knew that whatever he was hiding, it was big enough to make him fear her awakening. One night in late September, Elizabeth found herself alone in the house. Andrew had gone out, claiming he needed to visit a colleague, but Elizabeth doubted the truth of his words. She had been noticing a pattern in his absences, the way they coincided with moments when she started asking questions. As the clock struck 9:30 p.m., she made her way to his study, a room that had always been off limits to her. She told herself she was imagining things, that her suspicions were the result of a mind still recovering from trauma. But the moment she turned on his laptop, Her doubts were replaced by cold, hard evidence. The laptop held everything. Emails between Andrew and Margaret, their tone casual and intimate, discussing not just their relationship but Elizabeth's condition. There were messages where Andrew vented his frustrations about her lingering existence and expressed a desire to move forward. Margaret had replied with promises to help, the implications chillingly clear. Elizabeth's hands trembled as she clicked through the files, each new piece of evidence a dagger to her heart. There were videos, too, clips of Andrew and Margaret together, laughing, touching, in the very home Elizabeth had built with him. And then there was the will, a document Andrew had been drafting in secret. It named Margaret as the primary beneficiary, erasing Elizabeth entirely from the life they had built together. The words on the screen blurred as tears filled her eyes. The man she had trusted with her life, the man she had loved without reservation, had been planning a future without her. Elizabeth sat in the dim light of the study, her breathing uneven as the weight of the betrayal pressed down on her. Memories from her coma flooded back with startling clarity now. She remembered the cold words Andrew had spoken to Margaret late one night, words she hadn't fully understood until this moment. She won't be here much longer. The sensation of the needle, the whispered reassurances from Margaret, the hollow sound of Andrew's laughter, all of it fell into place. For the first time since her awakening, Elizabeth felt something new stirring within her. It wasn't sadness or confusion. It was rage, pure and unfiltered, bubbling up from a place she didn't know existed. The life she had spent years dreaming of returning to wasn't just gone. It had been destroyed by the very person who was supposed to protect it. Andrew hadn't just betrayed her, he had treated her like a burden, a problem to be solved, all while pretending to be the devoted husband. As the clock ticked past midnight, Elizabeth closed the laptop and rose from the chair. She moved through the house slowly, her footsteps deliberate. The walls around her, once symbols of the life she had built, now felt like a prison. Each room held memories, but they were tainted now, poisoned by the truth she had uncovered. Elizabeth knew she couldn't confront Andrew yet, not until she had pieced together every detail, not until she had a plan. But one thing was clear. The man she had once loved had become a stranger, and she would never look at him the same way again. The days that followed were marked by a quiet intensity. Elizabeth kept her newfound knowledge to herself, watching Andrew carefully, noting every lie he told, every nervous glance he threw her way. She didn't need him to confess. She already knew the truth. And with each passing day, the rage within her grew, simmering. It was the evening of October the 14th, 2012, and the tension in the Whitman home was thick enough to cut through. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as if the house itself knew what was about to unfold. Elizabeth had spent the day pretending everything was normal, masking the storm that had been brewing inside her since the night she discovered Andrew's betrayal. She moved methodically through her routine, her face calm, her voice steady, but her mind was racing. Every glance at Andrew, every word he spoke, fed the fire that had been smoldering within her. Andrew, unaware of what Elizabeth had uncovered, remained indifferent, even aloof. He had stopped pretending to care, his interactions with her mechanical and devoid of warmth. That night, as they sat across from each other at the dinner table, Elizabeth finally let her carefully constructed mask slip. Her voice was sharp, her words cutting straight to the heart of the matter. She confronted him, not with anger, but with a quiet resolve that was more chilling than any outburst. Andrew didn't deny it. He didn't flinch, didn't apologize. Instead, he met her accusations with cold detachment, as if he had been waiting for this moment. He spoke without emotion, his words sharper than any weapon, dismissing Elizabeth as if she were a burden he had carried for far too long. He framed himself as the victim, lamenting the years he had spent caring for her, calling her dead weight and insinuating that her accident had ruined his life. Elizabeth sat there, absorbing every word. Her hands gripped the edges of the table, her knuckles turning white, but her face remained unreadable. Inside, however, something shifted. The years of betrayal, the stolen moments she could never reclaim, the weight of his disdain. It all coalesced into a single unrelenting thought. She knew then that there would be no forgiveness, no reconciliation. Andrew had taken everything from her, and in return, he felt nothing. The rest of the evening passed in silence. Andrew retired to the bedroom without so much as a glance back at Elizabeth, leaving her alone in the dimly lit dining room. She sat there for hours, her mind replaying the events of the day, the evidence she had found, and the man she once loved who had become a stranger. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, Elizabeth rose from her chair. Her movements were deliberate, almost mechanical, as she walked through the house, her eyes scanning the rooms that had once been filled with love and laughter. Her gaze landed on the iron sculpture. It stood on the mantel, a gift she had given Andrew on their 10th wedding anniversary. It was meant to symbolize their strength, their resilience as a couple. Now, it felt like a cruel reminder of everything they had lost. She reached for it, her fingers brushing against the cold, unforgiving metal. It felt heavy in her hands, solid and unyielding, much like the anger that consumed her. Andrew had fallen asleep quickly, as if their confrontation hadn't mattered at all. He lay on his back, his breathing slow and steady, completely unaware of the storm brewing just feet away. Elizabeth stood in the doorway of the bedroom, the sculpture held tightly in her hands. Her breathing was shallow, her heart pounding in her chest. This wasn't an impulsive act. It was the culmination of years of pain, betrayal, and heartbreak. She stepped closer, her footsteps soundless on the plush carpet. The moonlight streaming through the window illuminated Andrew's face, serene and peaceful, a stark contrast to the turmoil inside her. Elizabeth hesitated for a moment, a fleeting second where the gravity of what she was about to do threatened to overwhelm her. But then she thought of the emails, the videos, the draft of the will that erased her existence. She thought of Margaret, of Andrew's cruel words at the dinner table, and the hesitation melted away. The first blow was precise, calculated. The sound of metal meeting flesh was sickening, but Elizabeth didn't falter. She struck again and again, each swing fueled by the memories that haunted her. The pain, the betrayal, the years of being treated as if she didn't matter. It all poured out of her with every strike. By the time she stopped, her arms were trembling, her breath ragged. Andrew's lifeless body lay before her, his face unrecognizable, the once pristine sheets now soaked with blood. Elizabeth didn't cry. She didn't scream or panic. She simply stood there staring at what she had done. The room was eerily silent, save for the faint hum of the air conditioning. Her mind was blank, the weight of her actions not yet fully registering. She set the sculpture down gently on the nightstand, as if it were still the cherished object it had once been. Elizabeth walked into the kitchen, her bare feet leaving faint, bloodied footprints on the tile floor. She rinsed her hands under the cool stream of water, watching as the crimson swirled down the drain. Her reflection in the window above the sink stared back at her, calm and unflinching. She didn't feel guilt or regret, only an odd sense of finality. For the first time in years, she felt like she had taken control of her life, even if it meant destroying it in the process. When the police arrived in the early hours of October the 15th, responding to a neighbor's call about loud noises, they found Elizabeth sitting at the kitchen table. Her robe was stained with blood, her hair disheveled, but her expression was unnervingly composed. She made no attempt to explain herself, no effort to flee. She simply sat there, staring ahead, as if she were waiting for them. The officers moved cautiously, their eyes darting between the blood-stained trail leading to the bedroom and the woman who had clearly been at the center of it all. One of them asked her what had happened, his voice steady but cautious. Elizabeth turned her head slowly, meeting his gaze, and spoke. Her words were calm, matter-of-fact, devoid of the emotion they expected. She told them he had deserved it. The confession sent shockwaves through the small town and soon, the entire country. The story of the brilliant architect who had awoken from a 5-year coma only to kill her husband became the headline of every major news outlet. The public was captivated, torn between sympathy for a woman who had suffered unimaginable betrayal and condemnation for the brutal act she had committed. The words Elizabeth spoke that night, "He killed me first," became a chilling echo that would haunt everyone who heard it. By the time the trial began in November 2012, the courtroom was packed. The case wasn't just about a murder, it was about morality, betrayal, and the breaking point of the human spirit. Elizabeth sat quietly at the defense table, her expression as composed as it had been the night of the murder. The prosecution painted her as a cold, calculating killer who had planned the act with precision. They highlighted her calm demeanor as evidence of her lack of remorse. The defense, however, told a different story. They described a woman pushed to the brink by years of emotional abuse, a woman who had endured not just the physical helplessness of a coma, but the unbearable pain of knowing she was being betrayed by the person she trusted most. They argued that Elizabeth's actions weren't premeditated murder, but the desperate act of a broken woman reclaiming her agency. The jury was left to decide, was Elizabeth Whitman a victim of circumstance, or was she a murderer? The courtroom was heavy with silence on December 18, 2012, as the jury delivered their verdict. Elizabeth sat still at the defense table, her hands clasped tightly. After weeks of her life being exposed to the public, this was the moment of judgment. The foreman declared Elizabeth guilty of manslaughter, not murder. The courtroom buzzed with mixed reactions. Some saw justice, others leniency. Elizabeth closed her eyes briefly, steady on the outside, but a storm brewed within. Her sentence, 10 years in prison. For many, her story sparked debate. Some viewed her as a symbol of resilience, a woman pushed to her limits, while others saw her as a cold killer. The world couldn't agree on whether Elizabeth deserved pity or punishment. When Elizabeth entered her prison cell on January 3, 2013, the cold walls were a stark reminder of what she had lost. The life she had built with Andrew was gone, destroyed by his betrayal and her actions. Yet in this emptiness, she found strength. She had survived years of silent suffering, and now she had clarity she never thought possible. Late at night, she would sit at her small desk, writing letters she would never send. One was for Andrew. In it, she poured out her hatred for him, the man who had shattered her trust and taken years of her life. But mixed with her anger was an unexpected gratitude. By pushing her to the edge, Andrew had forced her to rediscover her will to live. Elizabeth reflected on the woman she used to be, naive, trusting, and eager to please. That version of herself was gone. She no longer needed validation, least of all from Andrew. Even in her cell, she felt freer than she had in years. As she folded the letter and placed it in a drawer, her hands were steady. The rage inside her had faded, replaced by quiet determination. Though the years ahead would be hard, Elizabeth was ready. In the solitude of her cell, she began to rebuild herself, stronger and wiser than ever before. Be sure to like and subscribe so you never miss our daily updates. If this story left you hooked, you won't want to miss another jaw-dropping case about the wife who buried her husband in the backyard and married another man on his grave. Check it out and share your thoughts in the comments below.